This is the first of the webinars that we are organizing as part of the Drought project, and I'm really pleased that we had the opportunity to organize this in collaboration with the National Farmers Union. And actually, this has been a co-created process as all the Drought project has been. We have here as a panelist also one of the members of our research team that has been an interdisciplinary research team. So maybe Tina, would you like to start introducing yourself?
Sure, I'm happy to do so. My name's Tina McGuinness. I'm based in the management school at the University of Sheffield, and my involvement in the Drought project has been looking particularly around business issues in the business domain, and part of that has brought in issues of agriculture and farmers' experiences in terms of water usage, water behaviours, the impacts in terms of governance and governance of water, and also the impacts in terms of business of, and I guess I should say, whilst the primary focus of the Drought project is drought, I think it's impossible to kind of talk about that without also contextualising things more broadly in the water continuum, because whenever you talk to farmers about water shortage, they'll also talk to you about when there's too much water and kind of the relationship across that continuum of water. I guess if I was thinking about this today in terms of some issues to talk about. The Drought project itself, just in case there's anyone here who isn't familiar with it, was based across 7 catchment case studies from the Eden in Scotland down to the Foy in Cornwall. And as part of that, we engaged with farmers across those different catchments. And things that if I highlight maybe 4 kind of talking points for us, this is not meant to be definitive or exhaustive, but if I highlight about 4 kind of key areas just as a point of reference for some discussion. The first thing that I'd highlight that emerged from the conversations and interviews we did with agricultural business was in terms of issues around water supply, not surprisingly, but that the experience across the different catchments was and could be very different, particularly reflecting the different gradients, the different kind of weather and climate experiences across those catchments, but also, of course, reflecting variation across the agricultural sector itself, from those who are primarily farming with livestock, through horticultural focus, through mixed kind of focus, and also, of course, significant impacts and implications in terms of size. So dependent upon the size of the particular business. And what we saw in terms of talking about water is that one of the first things that came up when you talk to farmers about water is abstraction and abstraction licenses. And a couple of key things there that farmers talked about was the relationship with the regulator, with the Environment Agency. And they talked about this in terms of historically a kind of a combative kind of relationship, but in more recent years, a more positive and constructive relationship. But there was a lot of talk about abstraction licenses, the restrictions on abstraction licenses, and the impact that that had in terms of people being able to access water. So there was one farmer who talked about the fact that they don't have a particular source of water themselves. They know that the regulations are getting tighter on abstraction, and they have neighbours further on up the stream who can abstract, so that they're actually number 4 potentially to abstract water during a dry spell. And that's got implications in terms of quality of water, in terms of flow of water, and that links in with some of the limitations and restrictions around abstraction. Another issue that came up in terms of water supply was around reservoirs, and farmers talked about reservoirs in really largely for them, it was a nice idea, but not practical in terms of the cost and benefit. So we did have some farmers that we talked to who had actually built their own reservoirs because they could justify the expenditure based on the amount of irrigation that they had. But even for those farmers who were building, the small number of farmers we spoke to were actually engaging with building and managing their own agricultural reservoirs, they didn't access support to do that because they found the regulations in terms of the amount of paperwork they talked about, the man hours in doing in putting together an application, and the guidelines in terms of doing that is just too restrictive. The other kind of things that came up were talking about boreholes. And some farmers have started to drill boreholes because they find that an easier method in terms of accessing water. But equally, we found other farmers who were talking about actually transferring over to potable water sources, and the big driver there for them was security of supply. So we found some farmers who were talking about security of supply being particularly important for them. And this reflected some issues around business practices and business models. So in terms of those growers who are growing crops such as potatoes, broccoli, those kinds of root vegetables, etc., having security of supply for irrigation was really critical for them, not least because of some of the contractual norms within business practice. So that typically farmers, if they're producing a crop and it's for a retailer on a production basis, if they can't produce that crop, they're contractually obliged to supply that volume at their own cost. And that is not sustainable for many farmers, really very many farmers to do for any length of time at all. So in terms of looking in terms of business models, there are certain structures there that actually make and enhance the risk that farmers face in terms of water scarcity or water stress even greater. And we find that also for some farmers that they had historically diversified. Very often in response, the big focal point for that was the foot and mouth crisis of the early 2000s. But some farmers were also more recently diversifying because of the various issues and challenges that face the farming community. But what they hadn't thought about and what they weren't really considering from kind of a systems or a broad kind of perspective was the relationship that those diversified aspects of the business might have in terms of water. So, for example, I can think of one farmer that we talked to who, as part of a diversification strategy, and they grew barley, so they decided we're going to start making whiskey, because that means that we can add value to the barley, we're creating a premium product, but of course that also has implications and demands in terms of water quality and supply as well. A number of different farmers talked about consumer expectations and market differentiation, particularly in talking about the whole issue of wonky vegetables. So of course, depending upon at what point in the growing cycle there is water stress, that can either impact upon yield or quality, or indeed both. And farmers talked about the big challenge in terms of outgrades or food wastage arising from producing crops that were below what were seen as appropriate levels of quality by the supermarkets because of what would be acceptable to the consumers. And they talked about the whole wonky vegetables as an interesting initiative, but one that really wasn't gathering a great amount of hold or gathering great traction. They talked about the complexity of the supply chain and how through processing and food processing there was some opportunity for capacity in terms of below par quality of vegetables, particularly from a visual point of view, for those to be integrated in terms of processing food. But there were kind of some concerns about, well, would there be, in the event of significant drought across the country, would there be significant capacity within that complex supply chain for that food, that outgrade products and vegetables to be incorporated in that? Another issue that arose was in terms of fodder and bedding. And again, this related to issues around supply chain. So particularly over the past couple of years, fodder costs have increased, and the supply chain in terms of fodder within the UK and across the British Isles has become more stressed. So there's greater demand, costs have gone up, animals are being kept indoors longer because of wet winters, but also in terms of the quality of the grassland and fodder that is harvested in the summertime, the quality is not quite as good, particularly in some areas than others. So that was increasing costs for farmers. That was having a big impact, particularly for smaller farmers in terms of cash flow. You know, and farmers talked about the Irish experience where the government was subsidising fodder costs. And the other implication of it was increased levels. Certainly people were talking to us to some degree about increased levels of criminality, that theft, you know. straw was being nicked, butter was being nicked, and that created a whole level of complexity and stress. The final kind of point that I want to highlight in terms of the agricultural sector is in relation to mental health. And obviously there's been statistics from the ONS which have highlighted that farming historically has always had relatively high suicide rates relative to other occupations. But certainly the message that was coming through from key stakeholders and from farmers was articulating stress, anxiety, and particularly financial stress arising from water issues, such as increased economic costs, lower revenue, having to spend more in terms of concentrates, fodder, and so forth. But I think it's fair to say that that was in conjunction with a range of other kind of stresses, particularly around the uncertainty around Brexit and so forth. One interesting thing that emerged was, and I think it speaks to the importance of this issue, was that in Scotland, they actually organised a visit from a guy who's called the Resilient Farmer, a New Zealand farmer called Doug Avery, who speaks extensively about stress, anxiety, suicide risk within the farming community. And they actually organised him to come over to do a speaking tour in Scotland in September and October of 2018. And the tour was called Drought, Adversity and Breaking New Ground. And I think that's a very clear example of the seriousness with which this issue is being seen. So those are just some headlines from some of the things that we've talked about.
Oh, that sounds great, fantastic. So I would love now to start involving our stakeholders in these discussions, because one of the aim of our project, of course, this wasn't a research project on farming, but was a research project with the farmers. So the farmers have been always part of our discussions. And one of the experiments we did, especially with the farmers in the Berry Slim catchment, especially with Catherine and Matt, who are representing the Berry Slim catchment right now, was also to try and use storytelling as a way of making the farmers' voices heard. And maybe in particular, Catherine, you want to start sharing your experience about being part of the local advisory group for the Dry project.
Lovely, thank you, Antonia. Yes, I was asked to become involved because I am the local group secretary at Ramsey and Whittlesea, and part is in the area of the Bevilsleen catchment area. And actually on the first meeting, it came out that it was quite fortuitous that there was a link with what I enjoy doing outside of work, connected with my love of agriculture and support of the industry, as part of the storytelling aspect was linked with the Drought Risk and You group. And I love drama, I direct and act outside work, and that was a great link in to some of my contacts in the area. Not only did we meet up regularly with some great other participants, there were historians, local drainage groups, scientists, the sort of stakeholders, Anglian Water. It was a great way to find out from people like the Great Fen Project about where their demands for water came. And I know Mike Wilson and Antonia were involved in a project in Sardinia which linked in to community storytelling, where you get together groups to discuss perhaps a topic where there are divergent points of view over a meal, and that can generate some great discussion and come to a shared understanding of the issues. And based on that perspective, we set out to do a small scale Reasons in English in Ramsey Rural Museum in June of 2016. So there was a court set up with a caricaturist, there were the speakers, there was a judge, there was a jury, and most importantly, there was a very nice meal at the end of it where people could discuss the topics, and then the results were discussed, and people came to a better understanding of different people's points of view. This was then repeated at the end of 2016 on a far larger scale in Ramsey Museum, not in Peterborough Museum and Art Gallery. The year before, an art collective called Metal had created a huge communal meal celebration of the link between city and the farms in the area. And it was a wonderful way of getting people together over a meal to talk about issues which linked so beautifully to the reasons. And a culmination of that was a display in the Arts Gallery in December 2016, where we hosted the larger scale reasons, which again, there was displays, great conversations from different people's perspectives, and superb meal resulting in a discussion and people getting together to talk over the issues. It's been a great, enjoyable way to find out some great scientists' points of view. There's been Ivan Grove from Harper Adams, who's been looking at all the different ways that plants will be effective over a 50-year period if a projected waterfall goes down. James Blake, who's has a huge infectious statistical mind and sort of makes modelling really interesting. So to share other people's perspectives and views on agriculture and what could happen in the future, and talking then to people with environmental concerns on the environment and where they need their water from. I've thoroughly enjoyed the time, and it's been a very enjoyable project, which again has linked my two loves of agriculture and drama.
It's great to hear this with you, and thank you for all the support you gave us during the local advisory group meetings. But as Tina was actually highlighting at the beginning, we've been working across different river catchments in the UK. And here we have the pleasure to have as a panelist Paul Hammett, who has been involved in both as a national stakeholder and of course at local level sometimes in the Fenland. Paul, could you please share something about your experience in the DRY project, and mainly and hopefully bridge the panelist group with the participants group, all the other farmers who are joining this webinar today, because I know you've been gathering farmers around this conversation and you want to hear from them.
My interest in drought was reawakened in 2010 to 2012 when we had very dry weather, and we realised that our country steeped in the history of cheap food and imported food, that the policy on food that our government is quite happy to import it, irrespective of whether farmers can grow food in right conditions or not. Fast forward to 2018, when we had an extended period of dry, hot weather. Farmers ran out of water, whereas no other sectors of community did, and we lost, in some places, the ability to grow the food we wanted to, at least in the quality that we would normally expect. I think the impact on farms in 2018 was lessened by the fact that the drought was Europe-wide, and so that meant that supermarkets were more willing than normal to reduce the specifications that you would normally expect. Maybe. And so fast forward to where we are now, June 2019, we're once again in the middle of a long, rain-free, dry, relatively warm period of weather, and we're waiting with bated breath as to how this will turn out. Really challenging for farmers, and it reminds me yet again that all the issues that farmers have to deal with, they really do take the risk of extreme weather events.
I was saying that you know the farmers, the participants, because I see some names, so maybe you want to invite them to participate. But I can read here the questions that we agreed to start with. And the first one that is on the top of your list and our list was about asking participants, farmers, to describe the effects of the 2018 drought on their farm.
Okay, right. Yeah, our farming system is, we're basically growing on the vegetable front, potatoes, beetroot and onions, which the most important thing to us is skim finish, because our buyers, that's what they look at. And the crazy thing about really what we have to do is on our skim finish is so they can look at it. And of course, when the housewife gets home, the first thing she does is peel it and throw that bit in the bin, which is the bit which is hard. But I think one of our biggest challenges going forward is the knowledge of our buyers, or lack of it, what we have to go through to produce that crop, as in water and whatnot. On the EA front, we have altered some of our licences, and they've been to fair quite helpful, really. So on our water supply, yeah, we've got a range of borehole, river water, and on the reservoir front, it's not really practical where, like ourselves, we're hiring different land off different farms each year to extend our rotation. So it's impractical to look at building reservoirs for once every few years. So that's some of my thoughts.
I think we've got Matt, who is part of the local action group. I don't know if Matt can say a few words.
I'd agree with the last speaker just said. We're struggling more every year with what our end users want. We're not so bad with skin finish because we're going to chip shops rather than the supermarkets. And this year we found good support from the chip shops, but only because there's been such a shortage of potatoes across Europe. With Europe having more rain than us this year, there could be more pressure on a better finish. Again, I agree, the need for reservoirs is fine. If you're in a central location, you can get your water about all the time. But for us, we don't need water every year. On an average rainfall, we probably don't need any water. So it makes that expense even greater. And I do agree, more than anything, it comes back, as we all know, to what the end producer wants and understanding, really, compared to the investment. It was really good to be involved with the scheme, just to see so many people's different opinions of what was expected in the local area. With such a different background, I don't think a lot of people quite appreciate what's going on around them, to be quite honest. That's really, other than that, Catherine summed up really what we went through really well, I think. The drainage boards as a whole are helping us a lot, but the movement of water is becoming a real issue around our catchment as well, with different licences and different people flouting the law, shall we say.
No, thank you, Matt. Is James still with us? Sort of a bit on the skirtland there, farming the other side of the A1, James. Have you any views on what water issues are for you?
Could you hear me now?
For us, the main water issues are kind of, like Matt said, a lot of people irrigating when they shouldn't be, and then the sort of lack of repercussions for them, really. I guess it doesn't seem fair on I suppose the smaller growers that are abiding by the rules that are suffering, whereas the larger people are flouting the rules and they're not getting penalised for it.
Hello.
Thank you, James. I know water is a big issue. As Matt said, when you need it, that's when then there is that high demand. Did I hear Clive in the background there?
I've got it on too. Can you hear me now?
We can.
Yeah, I agree with Matt on one of the two things. In our area around here, a lot of potato growing, get bigger companies coming in, want to rent land and grow more acres. They just bring all their irrigation equipment over and suck all the water out the deep. Taking water from the local farms. I know, the bigger you are, a bit better enterprise can afford to do stuff like that, and not worry about the consequences. But the only thing is, I'm a lot of people have a holiday and go abroad, and it amazes me that they're watering every plant there is around the hotels and what have you. Every day, you never see many dry patches of grass and that around in Europe and around there, but they've got a system where they recycle the water. And I think we could save water with hairs in the States that they can't have some sort of system that the water what the hairs can do everywhere else. And around this area, I've grown a bit through more spring crops than what we used to, and we're suffering a bit with the spring crop because it seems to be always a dry time of the year. And I think we'll soon end up irrigating cereals, spring cereals and different crops if the climate changes like it did. So there's going to be more, more water needed. So we've got to have some sort of storage system. Instead of waiting, I live between two rivers, and when it rains over the side of Peterborough and Northampton, the water comes down into our system, and when we've got no use for it, it's just dumped at sea. I don't know whether there's some sort of way of, the EA store have a communal reservoir or something on some of the land what's normally a washland. Why can't it be a communal reservoir so everybody could draw off it when it's needed instead of dumping it out in the sea? That's some of my thoughts anyway.
Thank you, Clive.
I see that there is Jonathan Brown, I think, trying to be a part of the conversation. We can see his name next to Galaxy S9.
That's it. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Ah, goodness, because this is my first time at this, and I've been scrabbling around trying to access the conversation for a while, but I finally made a connection. I missed the very first part of the meeting and sort of came to it just as Catherine was offering up her comments on last year. If I can offer my own thought, whilst yes, the water situation was serious, and the heat would probably be the biggest issue I would allay from would consider from last year. The major issue, crops stop growing in that heat. Those continual days of 30 degrees, all the plants just stop growing, and almost irrespective of how much water you put upon them, they just weren't growing. You were just keeping them at maintenance. And then when the heat disappeared, especially in crops such as potatoes, they ignited their growth patterns again, which in some varieties led to quite considerable shaping, which led to quite considerable wastage elements. Yes, we were all helped by Europe also enduring a very strong hot summer, limited water supplies, which allowed the UK crop to keep its supply base maintained. However, with the massive potato crop I'm talking about here now, with the massive crop of the 17 harvest, there was quite a lot of potatoes kept deep into the autumn of last year, which helped supply the market here. Had there not been that massive crop of 17, then potatoes would have been very short indeed. And looking going forward, with the dry winter, we may be in a circumstance where potatoes, onions, because may yet, if they don't have sufficient water, be in short supply this late summer, early autumn. But it is the heat that is the critical issue for us. Did you get any of that?
Yeah, this is very interesting. Yeah, I remember I'm not a farmer, I'm not an expert, but I remember I was shocked when I heard from Matt, I think it was saying with like the engine of the tractor was becoming so hot that then couldn't be used or could burn the soil or something like that.
Going forward, in the particular area which I live in, it's called the middle level. There are discussions within the middle level and Anglian Water and the Environment Agency going forward on water resources. And we are desperately trying, all the water that comes into our system here comes through one course, lock, and we are in discussions with Anglian Water to try and adjust their water requirements for fill of Rutland Water so that more water through this 6 to 10 week period can come into our system to allow more water to be available for the farmers growers in this area to take advantage of. It is a very peculiar system where a navigation here called statutory rights, so we cannot drop our water courses much more than about 10 inches dead full, dead empty, and boats can't get through the docks or get stuck under the bridges. So we had a very limited water board. So it is quite quickly that farmers and growers in this area can lose the ability to irrigate their crops. Now, with these ongoing discussions with the Environment Agency and Anglian Water, we are hoping to change the profile of water take by Anglian Water into the Rutland Reservoir to provide more water for the farmers and growers in this particular area. So hopefully that is some better news going on. And there are, all will be aware of this, Paul Hammett will be aware of these ongoing discussions, and we're quite hopeful that we can have some real impact there in the ability of growers in our little neck of the woods to gain water opportunities. Does that help?
Thank you, that's very interesting. I'm not sure we heard from Jim and Michael.
Michael Bubb online here. I've eventually got hold of. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Sorry about that. Can I speak, or do you want me off for the minute?
No, I want you in. So.
Right. I'm sorry I haven't heard what's gone on before, but I've got a few views. We're growing arable crops in Shropshire, including 200 hectares of potatoes, and we've got good water licenses, but we are growing some without irrigation backup, and we have got reservoirs as well. I think the way forward is more reservoirs to alleviate flooding and to gather water for irrigation. And in the high drought last year, we had one landlord who had 100 million gallon license on his farm, borehole, just simply for environmental uses. And he hadn't used it for 7 years because he'd got to pay the electricity bill, and they wouldn't let us have, Environment Agency wouldn't even consider 2 million gallons of that as an emergency to irrigate our potatoes. And we offered to give up 2 million in another borehole, in another catchment area, but we were 6 weeks fiddling about and got nowhere. So my view is somebody somewhere has got to be a lot more flexible and take more risks. And you know, I don't think it's rocket science. It just needs a bit of common sense in the job. Is that okay?
It's great. And how do you think these people could hear your voice? How do you think that they could understand what you really need?
Well, I think it is really, Paul Hammett is the one across the nation who can make them listen, but he's so busy when the pressure's on, and sometimes you could argue that the farmer should plan ahead, but sometimes you can't always envisage a season like last year. So what has happened is that McCain's have had to import chips from America, where effectively we could have produced them had we have had the opportunity of this water that's tied up for environmental purposes that has never been used. And so I think the environment, it wants one central person with a computer who's prepared to make a decision, take a risk, and trust the farmers not to be ridiculous about it. It just needs common sense, in my view.
Paul, have you got anything to respond about this? Who is
Pardon?
No, I'm asking Paul to add something on this. Who is taking these decisions, how to make these decisions effective? Because Michael is talking about planning in advance, but sometimes there is not enough time. So how could we improve this decision-making process and make farmers' voices more visible and heard?
Firstly is policy and how we encourage policymakers to understand farmers' need for water as an essential use alongside the essential use of water for the environment and for human drinking and sanitation needs. And we've got a long way to go on that. And that's a work in progress and something that we're all responsible in working on. The second part of what Michael said, absolutely key, is how we can find. So I've talked about farmers taking the risk of these dry weather events, how we can help farmers to manage those risks better. And that's everything from storing more water, storing surplus water in reservoirs for use when we need it. That's sort of happening, and there's been a lot of reservoirs built. And strategically, there's a lot of support for it. But when we get down to the farm level, there are always barriers put in the way of farmers. For example, the planning system is unnecessarily putting barriers in farmers who are simply trying to dig a hole in the ground to store what everybody thinks is a great idea. And the other type of way that we can help farmers to manage the risk is by giving them more information. That's to understand the forecasting coming our way and understand what water availability there will be better, even better weather forecasting and those sorts of things. There are all sorts of ways in which we can continue to improve the situation. As we say, it's as if like when the chips are down, farmers are definitely the most vulnerable in these situations.
Yeah, as you know, Paul, in our project, we've been exploring potential impacts of climate change in the future. So how do you think that the farming community is reacting to reduce those impacts, and how could do that?
So I'll just keep, we're having a conversation very much about irrigated crops, fruit and vegetables with abstracted water. And I think that the farmers we've got on this call are already pretty well tuned in with what they need to do in terms of, as I've said, storage, greater efficiency in how they use their water, understanding better water availability. The availability of water and the weather situation are both very dynamic, and so it's understanding what's available on any given day and making most advantage of it. And then, as we go, as time goes on, I think we get a better appreciation and understanding of how we can farm with limited amounts of water. So, for example, on Thursday, I was with farmers in the Norfolk Broads, and they are gradually moving from main crop potatoes, the potatoes, to growing salad potatoes that need water at an earlier time of year and don't need so much water per kilogram. And they are just adapting to their local situation. Not everybody can do that, but those are the sorts of ways in which I think farmers will gradually continue to adapt to climatic change.
That's very interesting. So I'm not sure if Jonathan is trying to, yes.
Yes, I think ultimately, and this is not everybody will like what I'm going to say, but ultimately going forward, if climate change is a real thing, then I think growers, farmers and everybody will have to start to consider the crops will be somewhat genome edited. And so, and I know some people can consider this to be GMO. It isn't. It's the if you're using the CRISPR technique of editing your chromosomes, then they're cutting out parts of your chromosome to make them more drought resistant, to make them more disease resistant. And I think ultimately, maybe not next year, but in 10 to 15 years' times, I think crops will be more and more heavily genome edited. And that may be ultimately the way that things like drought resistance are conquered. But that's quite a radical thought, but it may be one that people then have to consider going forward.
Well, I quite agree with that, because there's a professor at Aberystwyth University who is well up in that, and as you say, it is doable. It's just a matter of the UK government taking some sort of lead. We need somebody with leadership who wants to feed the nation rather than import everything. That's what I feel.
Yeah, I think genome editing is a significant thing going forward, but at the moment it is blocked by the EU as considered genetically modified. But it is different. It's not as if you're taking the DNA from a daffodil and shoving it in a rhino so you get yellow rhinos. It is particularly cutting into chromosomes and splicing them back together to take out some nasties, you know, some like this, or drought tolerance. You can get your crops into a much better 21st century condition with the use of this technology. I'm sure as life goes on in the next 15 years, this is going to come more and more to the fore, and maybe that is the answer to a lot of the farmers' ails with regard to drought, particularly.
May I ask a question to everyone here? I guess Jonathan's just talked about science, and particularly the role of kind of modification in terms of helping to create drought-resistant crops. But what do people generally, or what role do people generally see science and technology as having in terms of helping farmers to cope better with drought in the future and with water stress in the future? Are there particular kind of aspects of science? I guess I'm thinking in terms of hydrological data or meteorological data or new technology in terms of irrigation. Are there any particular areas that you think science could make a really useful contribution?
Well, the genome editing will make this contribution. I'm no scientist, and I couldn't tell you where to look or what data to go to, but I'm sure worldwide there are people who are far cleverer than me and far more versed in this technology that particularly in the United States, and I believe in China, India and the Far East, they are marching along at quite a rate. So probably out there will be this technologies for drought resistant crops, but personally I couldn't tell you where to go and find it.
Maybe Paul has something to add?
Well, I think that Jim Scarrett is wanting to contribute as well. I would respond to Tina by saying that science has a considerable contribution to make. I'm thinking of current experiments in Kent in the soft fruit sector that's understanding plant physiology and understanding how water can be applied only when the plant is at a critical stage of stress. So we find that growers can be overwatering plants because of, just to be safe, and science can tell us what the actual amount of water that a plant needs under stress conditions.
Okay, so we've got other 8 minutes before we have to leave this platform. So I think one of the points that Tina made at the beginning about well-being, the farmers' well-being, it was quite, I mean, for me, was quite crucial. Can you envisage any impact current and potential in the future on your well-being and your family's well-being? And this is a general question for everyone who wants to contribute to this.
Well, I would say, Antonia, that it's a mental state of the farmers we're talking about, because we're going to the banks to ask for £1 million to grow these crops, and if we don't come up with the goods, the processors could well penalise us for not keeping to contract, and we won't take the risks we've been doing in the past. And all that will happen is the crops will get grown in America and imported. And I think it's a political problem you've got. I was in Spain the other week, and Spain can do it down at Murcia. They're well organised on the water. There's just not there hasn't been the overall desire to everybody to work together, politicians, EA and the farmers, for the benefit of the UK people.
Thank you, Michael. That's very important. Thank you.
Could I just say something? A bit of a late start to this one, so apologies. Just on the, I know Paul mentioned about the planning. I'm going back a step, really. Sorry. Paul mentioned about planning for reservoirs. We just have planning for a reservoir. We have 2 already, and we suck out of boreholes and rivers. But, in terms of planning, our planning was actually relatively simple. We just got planning for a 50 million gallon reservoir on a 28-day rule, which I have to say I was very, very surprised about. I was expecting a long, laborious, ongoing battle with planners and what have you. But when we decided to invest in it, then I was absolutely gobsmacked, really, with the speed that we've got it, and we're just about to start building it sort of this month. So that was one thing I'd just like to mention. And also, I agree with an awful lot of these points here today. And the high temperatures last year was one that I would just like to mention again, because that was a real issue for me personally. You know, we've got 10, 12 irrigators going, and quite a bit of drip irrigation going. And when the temperatures got to 30 degrees plus, you know, it was a case of, you know, we're putting an inch of water on some of these crops just to keep them alive, let alone get them growing, just to stay alive. And I suspect we were possibly losing 15, 20% of some of that water on some of those days, hot days. I don't know to be exact. Yeah, that was my view on that one. And also science, I think the last 10, 15 years we've come a massive distance from where we were 10 or 15 years ago to where we are now, with the different ways we can keep our eye on our irrigation. And I've got probes all over our salad crops and potato crops, onion crops, parsnips and what have you. And it is, I mean, scientists and farmers just need to work hand in hand, which I think they are now. So yeah, it's just my view.
Jim, could you describe, you were talking about the reaction of your crops at the height of high temperatures in 2018, and you rushing around to irrigate them or to keep them alive. could you describe what that's like? What the working conditions are like?
Yeah.
How are you and your farm worker colleagues dealing with all this? And what pressure does it put you all under?
Yeah, it's a tremendous amount of pressure. You know, when it's at 30 degrees temperature, I have 12 irrigators going with various pumps and boreholes and what have you, and I normally split into 2 teams. So I have two teams of 2, and those teams sometimes split individually. So I may have 4 people moving the irrigators, but that's just continually all day. So out of my team of 5 men, 4 of them will be on irrigation. I have a sprayer driver, and he's flat out spraying 100% all the time. And then there's myself, and then I drop in and pick up the bits that either guys don't manage, or I'm the or can you just do this, Jim, or can you just go and fetch that sort of thing. You know, I'm the gopher type thing. But it's kind of tremendous pressure with sort of those hot days when there's no rain at all. I think we did 12 weeks more or less non-stop, 7 days a week irrigation, you know, without a day off. It was just pretty manic and crazy, really. So, you know, and the men get tired, they get a bit ratty with each other, understandably. But at the end of the day, they realise that the crops need the water on, because at the end of the day, good skin finish on our potatoes, on our salad crops, on our main crops, you know, good size onion, that's what makes money. And that's, you know, that's why we're still here and still going. You know, that's why, you know, they get a bit of a bonus at the end of the year as well. So I think they all appreciate that, but it runs you ragged, you know, you're tired. It's just relentless, absolutely relentless, and you're so exhausted from the heat as well. So yeah, that's pretty much it, Paul.
I think that's enough. Thanks, Jim.
Sorry, Antonia, just a couple of bullet points from myself. I think science has got a big way to go, but very much the same as the pressure on water. Public opinion has got to be changed on the need for water in different places. We can grow vegetables across Europe or the rest of the world, but we can't import our problem. We're bringing vegetables in with water content in them, remember, and other places do need the water the same. And on the finance point of view, single farm payment, whatever you want to refer to it as, is coming to an end in the next few years. And that is a backup for a lot of farms on a bad income year. That's not going to be there. It's not an insurance, but it does give us some sort of return on a bad return year. They're all things investment-wise. And I think most farmers just want to be seen with a bit more appreciation across the whole of what they're doing, to be honest.
That's very interesting, thank you. So we got just a couple of minutes to close this session. And first of all, I want to thank you all. Ask our wonderful colleague, Tina McGuinness, to maybe close as she started with that brilliant list of key issues. Have you got any thoughts after these conversations that you want to share? And then we need to leave this platform in a minute. But I hope we will be in touch and to have more opportunities to explore those issues and probably find new ways of sharing ideas and making them more visible.
Thanks very much, Antonia. I think there's been some really interesting discussion here and some really useful insights into the farming experience, you know, from the people who've been involved here. And I think the value of actually talking about things with others in the sector and across the sector. I was thinking with the various things that people were talking about, there is, you know, there seemed to be an implicit recognition, or it seems to me, that we're facing a new normal in terms of drought and water stress in the UK, and that various parts and various sections and various groups are trying to catch up with normal. And I guess part of that kind of adaptation, you know, is the big challenge to the farming sector, and certainly to the farmers that I talked to and heard their different stories, is about capacity building, and capacity building in terms of resilience. So thinking about types of crops, adaptation of crops, adaptation in terms of the growing cycle, what's planted, when it's planted, and making adjustments to reflect this kind of new situation. And also, you know, issues around collaboration and cooperation, you know, that farmers share very similar experiences. And I guess one other issue that kind of occurred to me whenever people were talking as well is that is there some opportunity for opportunity in this new kind of situation where farmers are facing the challenge of drought and water scarcity?
Thank you very much, Tina. I really like this idea of, you know, understanding challenges, but also opportunities. And I would close on this positive note. And then I'll be very happy to keep in touch with all of you. And I will share the video recording of this webinar with all of you. Thank you, everyone.